tonight. So welcome. Welcome to our third RISE session, Educators RISE for Racial Equity, which is Teaching with Primary Sources program in partnership with Barry Education Foundation. So Barry Education Foundation partnered with DePaul University and selecting DePaul as the subcontractor on their grant from the Library of Congress, Teaching with Primary Sources. So we are very grateful to Sheila Smith, the CEO of BARA, to the library for this grant, and to my DePaul colleagues on this call. So as we begin today, I do want to introduce our team one more time. Our team consists of Dr. Tina Curry. So if you scroll around, you'll see the brilliant Dr. Tina Curry, who is an equity coach and DePaul adjunct and CPS instructor, literacy coach, and just brilliant educator. And you'll see Felicia Shaviri. Felicia is also an equity coach and brilliant educator. And you will also see Dr. David Bates, who is a history professor at Concordia University, and we are lucky enough that he is an adjunct for DePaul. And then you'll also see our online designer, Susan Lamparter, who's a member of our team. And many of you, if you're in the micro-credential, you're probably getting contact from Susan. And then my incredible graduate assistant, Lei Mao, who's in our doctoral program in educational leadership, as well as another one of our doctoral program graduate assistants, Caitlin Meyer. So we have an incredible team at DePaul. We're so glad to be here with you today. And as we begin together, I'm actually going to take us through a little bit of a grounding meditation that's called a meditation for wise action, especially for you, Dr. Molly. So wherever you are, if you could sit with your feet planted firmly on the ground and kind of slide back in your chair, so you feel the back of your chair against you. And this actually is a practice from neuroscience. It says when we feel our back supported and our feet supported, we most naturally are ready for relaxation. And just, if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please close them, but take a really deep breath in and hold it for 4, 3, 2, 1. Now slowly release that breath for 4, 3, 2, 1. And so as you continue that deep, slow breathing, I want you just to set a silent intention for yourself to be open and curious and receive whatever comes your way, but also set an intention that's just yours about doing racial equity work. For myself and our team, our hope is that tonight we inspire you, that we motivate you for that good action, and that we also support you in this process, which, as Dr. Curry just mentioned a bit ago, is hard work. But we are here to guide you on that journey. And there are a couple questions I'd like you to consider as we go through tonight. And it's part of this meditation, as you're breathing deeply, of asking yourself, how did I show up in the world today? Did I show up with equity as my driver? Did I show up accepting and supportive? And how did my privilege maybe show up if you happen to be white? And what actions can you take to help to become more aware of that privilege and its impact on others? And what can you do today to be that champion for equity, whatever small act it can be? So as you ponder those questions, we're going to, and you can open your eyes if you like to continue to have your eyes closed, totally understand it. But we're going to begin today with just setting our norms. And if you look on the screen, we hope that you, in the chat, you can share your name and one hope that you have for this webinar, where you're from, so we can get a good sense of who is with us here today in community. And our norms are to create this space as a brave space, to come to it with open heart and mind and stay present and fully engaged. And we know it's the end of the day for many of you. We hope that you can just be with us and know that whatever you bring to this space, we support and hope to move you in whatever direction you need. And know that there's going to be some discomfort. When we do racial equity work, it's not comfortable, it's not easy, but it's the most important work in my opinion. And if you can use the chat however you'd like to engage in any thoughts you're having, any reflection you're even having at this moment. We just ask that you use I messages so that we speak from our experience, and that for all of us here together, we assume positive intent and withhold any judgment. We come together to do this hard work together. And so with that, I'm going to switch and introduce my colleague, Dr. David Bates, who's going to take us through just an overview of RISE. David?
Good evening, everybody. We've sort of mentioned some of these aspects in the past, but I think it's important to reinforce them, that our basic orientation here is toward change. It's toward positive change in the future. And so we think that examining history is vital to doing that. And the best way to understand history is to work with primary sources, which are the original sources from the time that we're looking at, because that's going to give you, as we say here, the context and culture of what was going on in the past. But we also think, more importantly, that there's not just a cognitive aspect to this in terms of examining sources and understanding the past. There's also an emotional and affective sense to this too, in that they can promote all these cognitive skills of inquiry and critical thinking, but we think that they also build empathy and self-awareness. And you could see self-awareness highlighted here. That's something we're going to be talking about in detail tonight, because I think it's one of the most important, but also one of the most difficult skills to pull from this process. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Tina for a moment.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the goals for tonight. And so we have three. The first one is to grow the impact and to be able to dismantle racism, but to do so using the Library of Congress primary sources as a tool to help us. I just noticed that someone put in the chat, I want to be able to inspire these difficult conversations. And so this is one way to do that. To increase self-awareness and understanding of historic causes of racism. That self-awareness piece you can see is highlighted because that's the work that we start doing, we pick up, and we never, ever, ever stop. It's the most important part because it's through self-awareness that allows us to influence others. And the last one for me, I say just as a Black woman, is the most important one, because without empathy, you can't begin to understand the impact of racism on people of color, especially African Americans. And so if I don't understand something, I can't fight against it. And so I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Keel, to walk us through the structure of the webinar.
Thanks so much, Dr. Curry. So tonight, much like if you joined us for our last webinar, we're going to give you a little bit of a welcoming activity that you can use. Today's is with a Waterfall Chat. And Felicia is going to guide us through that. And then we're going to share some research and information with you, kind of the grounding theory behind the concepts that we'll present to you in our model lesson. And then the third part is we're going to actually walk you through that lesson or experience. If you happen to be an educational leader or principal or assistant principal, you can use this lesson with your faculty. If you are a K-12 teacher, you can use this with your students. If you're from a different organization, you can use this with your staff. So we want to give you practical information as well as research and theory, and also create that community together. So with that, Tina is going to take you through a Waterfall Chat.
And Felicia.
I'm sorry, Felicia.
No worries, no worries. Okay, welcome, folks. And in the Waterfall Chat, what we'd like for you to do, okay, here's the exercise. I want you to think about an adjective that would describe what you think about our nation currently, like right at this moment. And I don't want you to put it in the chat just yet. I just want you to think about it. And I'm going to count down from 3 to 1. So when I say 1, only then do you hit the send button, because we want it all to come in at the same time. And we're going to show you something really cool. Okay, you ready? 3, 2, 1.
Wow.
Beautiful. Wow, thank you. Okay. Opportunity.
Wow. Well, it looks like there's a lot of consensus.
Yeah. But you know, Dr. Kill, there's a lot of disappointment, disheartening. It's it's a lot of uncertainty that's there, but I look at the opportunity ones. I see opportunity in there, and that just is a light for me.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me whenever we do Waterfall Chat is the first response and the last one. Teresa says worn out. And I think as a country, we are worn out. I think we're worn out from systemic racism. I think we're worn out from all of the hurt and the trauma. And that yet, as my friend Dr. Curry says to me always, we need to get going and get working hard towards equity. And the first response in the chat that came in is lost. So our goal today is to really look at awareness as one of the keys to not be lost and to gain that energy that we need in order to do this very hard work. So we're going to present you with some research and theory around how self-awareness as a key driver of RISE. And if you remember, RISE stands for reflection, inquiry, self-awareness, and empathy. We're going to look at self-awareness. Self-awareness, as Dr. Curry said, is really key to even understanding our biases and beliefs. We know that self-awareness is the contradiction to implicit bias. If we can be more self-aware, be more aware of our biases, we can make more informed decisions. So what you see on the screen in front of you is some research from Brene Brown. If you're familiar with Brene Brown, she does a lot of research on shame and vulnerability, which is also connected to self-awareness. She also does a lot of research around leadership. One of the things that her research with thousands of leaders has indicated is that without self-awareness, we create distrust and disengagement, and that eggshell culture of inauthenticity where people are just afraid to speak, afraid to share their truth, afraid also to be able to contradict racism when they see it, but also to be afraid to express whatever bias that they have that might be able to be uncovered and eliminated with some self-awareness. Within RISE, what we know is that growing self-awareness is really possible using primary sources. We can look at self-awareness, which requires a higher level of cognition, and self-awareness that requires information gathering. What we know is that self-awareness is really looking at who we are, the thoughts, the feelings, the beliefs that we have, and looking at those similarities, those intentions, and the goals that we have. It's our self-awareness that bridges the divide between people. It's that first step to being aware that something might be blocking, that something might be in our way, but it's also a lack of self-awareness that as teachers gets in our way of seeing our students. Self-awareness is vital to those of you who are educators. And I know, Tina, you wanted to add something.
I was just engaging in the chat. When I think about myself, I can't imagine, I said this to Dr. Kill, I can't imagine being in a school being led by someone who is not self-aware, or myself sitting in the classroom and having a teacher who's not self-aware. So it's going to be really critical that we become people who are really self-aware. It's almost like remarrying yourself to yourself, if that makes sense.
It does. And one thing we want to share with you just kind of historically in terms of self-awareness, which was a little known fact that we came across in the research, is that Benjamin Franklin, somebody that our country holds in high esteem for his intellect and his innovative thinking and inventiveness, used to keep a balance sheet of his own, which was his own method of self-awareness. And the balance sheet was about his personal strengths and weaknesses. He would mark down each day what he self-perceived as his weaknesses and what he self-perceived as his strengths by engaging in this constant daily reflective practice of self-awareness. It's a practice that others have taken from Benjamin Franklin's writings, and which really can serve as a model for us. If each day we walk ourselves to a reflective piece that says, where have I showed up? What are those limitations? What are the things that I've done exceptionally well? Now, how do I just shift myself for the next day to do more of those? And primary sources give us the language. Primary sources give us the way to be compassionate, to be empathic, but they give us the prompt. So it's often when you're having a discussion with students or with adults that you're stuck right away in the cultural norms that keep you closed. When you have an evocative picture, like the one on the screen, between an African-American man and a white man, a picture that creates within your own mind and your own heart a story. You're able to open that door that's blocked by cultural norms and to be able to engage in dialogue to really help reframe whatever beliefs you may have that are keeping you potentially stuck or not stuck. And what we know too about self-awareness is that if we can write down our plans and our priorities and ask trusted friends about how well we are in our own awareness of how we interact with them and get regular feedback, then we can grow that self-awareness. Self-awareness is like a muscle. It's a muscle that needs to be exercised. So consistently asking someone, do you engage with me in ways that prove that I'm really taking care of myself, that I'm trying to evolve as a person, that I want to know how well I impact someone. Asking someone, how do I impact you? When I do workshops with teachers, I often tell them about one of the best self-awareness strategies that I've ever learned, which is, you can use it tonight after you're done with this webinar, is to go to someone who you care deeply about or someone you work with and ask them to rate you on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being you are the absolute epitome of the best in that relationship, and 1 being you're the worst. So you ask them to rate you on this scale of 1 to 5, and you tell them that they cannot give you a 5. No matter how much they love you, care for you, they can't give you a 5. And then you listen and they give you a rating. And so typically people who care about you and who don't want to cause conflict will give you a rating of a 3 or a 4. But once they give you that rating, here's the important question. And this is the one I encourage you to try tonight. Ask somebody to rate you and then say, what would it take for me to be a 5 for you? That one little question, what would it take, will open up to things that you are not aware of yet that you maybe do for that person, whether that is something as simple as, don't interrupt me when I'm speaking, or as complex as it doesn't feel like you connect on the same level as I do. So take that little tool. You can do this with students as well. And sometimes with students, they'll tell you very harsh truths. But it's those harsh truths, the one that sticks with you is the one that you want to work on. So what we're going to do now is, that was our little experience in the research and theory behind RISE, behind that self-awareness piece, which really comes from that entire body of work around vulnerability and increasing our ability to step outside our own ego and watch what we're doing. We're going to model for you a lesson. And our purpose in this lesson is really to look at history and how history impacts our bias and our view of racial equity. So if you notice, the title of this particular RISE session and this lesson is really healing from history. Is how do we really look at history, look at the biases that it brings up for us, and then how do we shift that bias? We're going to explore our own bias using Library of Congress, and we're going to learn about implicit bias and dismantling bias, and we're going to practice some skills of self-awareness to deepen our own anti-racism beliefs. And so, Felicia, do you want to guide us through the I am from? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Okay, I'm back again. Okay, so the I Am poem, which is originally written by George Ella Lyons, is a poem that talks about where we're from, and it helps you to identify the self with your perspective of who you are. And so what we'd like for you to do, am I reading mine now? I'm sorry, Dr. Kim.
Yeah. Why don't you, so what you see on the screen is mine, which is a white woman's poem. And you can tell if you do not know who Mary Tyler Moore is or Romper Room, you are older than 30. You are younger than 30, sorry. But Tina, we thought it would be important for Tina and Felicia and even Dave to share a little bit of their I Am From poem is, and what we would do with students is the same thing. You share a poem with them and then you engage them in writing their own. So as you listen to Felicia share her poem, and then hopefully Tina would share a line of hers, and even Dave in the chat, you can share a line of yours. So you get the experience. So please do, Felicia, I can't wait.
Okay. This one was actually kind of funny to me, but it's I am from number 2 pencils, from Trend Detergent and Dial Soap. I am from the biggest front yard with fights in the alley and relay races, passing putting a piece of wood through gangways. I am from dark and cold and bone-chilling winters. I'm from maple trees, whose limbs were, I am from maple trees whose limbs were used as a stairwell leading me away from the madness.
If you notice, thank you for being so vulnerable. It does bring up a great deal of emotion to go back to those places and to really think about those things that aren't often in our consciousness. So, Tina, did you want to share a couple of lines of yours?
Sure. Mine made me think about how loved I was as a child growing up. So the lines I chose to share are, I am from cornbread and collard greens, from eating fruit from the peach tree, pear tree, apple tree, and fig tree until my stomach would hurt. I am from a bowl of cereal and cartoons on Saturday mornings after taking the slops out to the hogs and getting the eggs out the hen house. I grew up on a farm in the Mississippi Delta. Best life ever.
Thank you so much, Tina. I had a feeling you weren't in urban Chicago. Dave, did you want to share a line of yours?
Sure, I can share a couple. I'm from the Jersey Shore, but but not that Jersey Shore. I'm from sledding downhill and riding bikes to the 7-Eleven. I am from educators and alcoholics, and I'm from a place that's trying to do a little better every day.
Beautiful. So I'd encourage all of you on this call, please feel free to put any lines of your I am from poem. And tonight, if you have a moment, or even tomorrow, take a few minutes to yourself and write where you're from. The process actually, which comes from, there's lots of exercises with this, with I am from, but the process of mindfulness that drove the exercise we're doing really does build the more you write. So if you start with that first line of, mine is I am from church on Sundays, but it also turned then to the real truth of I'm from those white neighborhoods and whispers of those people. That's the recollection that I had as I started to go back. But I'm also from that rage at inequity and committing to growing as an anti-racist. So it comes to that part of you that wants to make change. And thank you so much for those of you who are putting your poems in the chat. They're extraordinarily compelling and moving. And so after doing the I am from poem, Tina's going to share with you how to work through norms with your students.
Right. So this is when you start to do this work, you do not want to skip this part, even if it takes a day, if it takes a few classes, establish norms with the community. If you are teachers working with young people, if you are leaders working with your staff. Because think about it, equity and anti-racism, anti-bias work is hard on the heart. So you need some established norms to help you to deal with your emotions. You need some agreed upon behaviors. You need to know what to expect from each other. And for us, norms have become our shared approach to engagement. And for us, creating norms helps us to foster strong engagement and achievement towards our objectives at the highest level. And to get started, you can just start with these simple questions. What is acceptable? What's not acceptable? Why are we creating these norms?
Thank you so much. And Dave, you want to walk us through the process?
Yeah, so this is a process, if you've attended before, that we've engaged in previously, where we're working with a very simple analysis tool from the Library of Congress that they call Observe, Reflect, Question, where you lay out some observations, you lay out some thoughts, and then you lay out some questions. And so in the chat, if you want to just look at this image here, so this is from 1925. Just some things that you see, things that jump out to you, things that this makes you think about, some thoughts or reflections that you have, or some questions you have. So you can put those in the chat, and I'll give you maybe a few seconds to put some things out there. Yeah, white men in control. Absolutely. I can share a reflection that I had is that one thing we were trying to think about is something that would be sort of evocative of what happened on January 6th. And one of the things that I had been reflecting on about the 6th is after sort of the initial shock wore off, I think the thing that stuck with me most is this very clear feeling that there are people that feel that their claim to power is legitimate no matter what, and that other people's claim to power is always illegitimate. And I think it's the same here. To see Klansmen parading through Washington, D.C. with the Capitol in the background, it's the same thing.
Yeah, one of the things that we realized is as we look to the very challenging events of recent months and this year, that if we look back historically with Dave's expertise, we were able to definitely pinpoint when this has happened before in our country, which to all of us is that spark of, well, if it's happened before, we need to get working harder because we're not changing anything. And so we wanted to keep that photo in mind as we think about implicit bias. So if you just, this is a very quick video that talks about the reality of implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an overrepresentation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Implicit bias.
Dave?
So one of the things that we really want to do in this session is think about how we can operationalize what we're talking about in terms of bias and do that through primary sources and historical analysis. And so we think that the analysis guide, the RISE analysis guide, is really crucial here. And the principles here, again, are key to keep in mind, that if you're using the tool we mentioned before, the observe, reflect, question, that's a vital tool for understanding a source and historical context. But this analysis guide builds on that by allowing you to reflect a bit about your own feelings, your own identity, your own beliefs, and to build a sense of self-awareness and a sense of empathy about your reaction to these sources. So the first step here is reflection. And this is, again, a simple 3-step process, but it goes a little bit deeper. So we have another image here from the Library of Congress. And I'm going to let you kind of put in the chat what you are seeing in this image. And so as before, it was observe, reflect, question. Now we're asking believe, feel, and do. So what do you believe about what you're seeing? What does this picture make you feel? And then what do you think are the actions that led to this photo? So we say injustice here. That's we're gonna have to explain that in a second. But what are some things you believe or feel when you look at this image? What emotions does this elicit in you? I think that to me, when I saw this for the first time without any context, I had sort of a positive reaction or a neutral reaction, that it's basically just a group of well-dressed young people, right? I agree with Jen in the chat that it looks, there's something a little unnatural or posed about it that's a little bit discomforting maybe, but that this is, essentially an innocuous historical photo. I can see we have some very bright people in this session. We're already a step ahead. So if we're looking at this image and we're thinking about maybe why it makes us uncomfortable, I can sort of give you the next photo here. And so if we're thinking about bias, and this was certainly a bias that I had myself, what I didn't realize I was looking at in the first image is that is an after image. This is the before image. And as somebody has already accurately pointed out in the chat, these are photographs from the Carlisle Indian School, which is a school in Pennsylvania, which is set up, and I'm quoting here, to kill the Indian and save the man. And the idea of these schools was to take Native American children from their homes and bring them to this school, this boarding school, and completely divest them of any sort of remnants of their indigenous culture. So to have them speak only English, to convert to Christianity, to dress in Western American kind of style clothes, to cut their hair, and to learn white American trades, basically carpentry or agriculture in very different ways than they had practiced it in their own communities. And so to me, this was a really powerful moment because my bias led me to look at the first photo, as I said, as either neutral or even positive, that this is just a group of well-dressed young people, maybe at a graduation. But in reality, that photo contains in it decades of violence and erasure of their culture, because these schools are very much forcing these students to give up everything that makes them themselves, essentially, and actively trying to erase Native Americans as a cultural group from America. And so when you're thinking about these kinds of images and when you're doing this reflective process, it's enormously important to think about yourself first. And I think that one of the most important parts of our journey in RISE is you do have to start with yourself. And I thought what Tina said before was really powerful, that you have to be self-aware to be an effective educator. And if you are not constantly interrogating your own bias and you're not creating that sense of self-awareness in yourself and allowing yourself to have feelings and reactions to these sources, you can't expect your students to do so either. That you have to let yourself interrogate where you're coming from and what your background is before you can move this forward.
So even when we look at bias, and if we look at implicit biases of the attitudes towards people or associated stereotypes without our conscious knowledge, the reality is those biases stay put without self-awareness. And the other key for those of you who are educational leaders is that all of the research would suggest an increased self-awareness is directly correlated to an increase in cognition. So you have to be self-aware in order to get those higher levels of rigor that we often strive for. Without the other, you're limited in scope. So in the chat, and if you were doing this with students, you would do this in a small group discussion or a breakout room. If in the chat, you could say, what new insight did you gain about your own bias just by doing this exercise of reflection on and self-awareness with the photo? And have you ever been the target of implicit bias yourself? It's an important reality. Have you ever been aware of your own implicit bias? And Tina or Felicia, if there's anything you want to share about either of those questions, feel free. I know, Tina, you once told me about a student in your classroom who was drumming on the desk. And Do you want to share that story? Because I think that's a great story of bias.
So students were working in small groups, and I noticed a student who was beating on the desk, and it was just really irritating because it was loud, and he was supposed to be participating in a group conversation. So, the teacher moved. I walked over, so to put myself, in close proximity, thinking if he saw me standing there, he would stop. He just beat louder. Okay. And so a student said something, and all of a sudden he stopped. He looked at her. He said, "Where's evidence of that? There is no evidence of that in this text anywhere." He was paying attention the whole time. But because that's not how I behave, I did not consider that acceptable learning behavior. He explained to me that making music and beats in his head is one way that he processes.
Yeah.
He was paying attention the whole time.
Our bias lives in so many forms and so many ways. When I was a principal, I started to notice that my African-American young women got the most detentions for how loud they were. And when I looked at it, and when I talked to the students and when I went to the room, what I was seeing was a pattern of behavior of our white teachers giving our African-American young women detentions as they walked through the hall or as they were in their homeroom. And it was this unawareness of their bias that only a certain volume was acceptable from young women. And it was this belief that within that context of that school, that they could only be acceptable if they were exactly how this teacher might have believed. But it's in unpacking those biases and getting self-aware that we become more aware. And Tina's going to talk more about how to dismantle those biases. You're introducing this, right?
Yes. Right. So we're getting ready to watch a video, but before we watch the video, I just want to say this. We need to acknowledge that we live in a world that is always feeding us negative, degrading ideas about a certain group of people. And so then that turns into bias. So we all have it. I have bias. And it doesn't mean that having a bias means that someone is racist. But if you don't check the bias, it can lead to engaging in racist behavior. And so as you watch the video, just start thinking about what are the bias that you hold. And I really want us to think about how can we break down cycles of discrimination that allow us to oppress our young people in schools.
Thank you, Tina.
Let's look at how to measure bias in ourselves and in others. Here's Dolly Chug from NYU.
We sent emails to real professors in real universities.
They contacted over 6,500 professors at random from 260 American universities.
We sent them an email that looked like it came from a real person asking for a meeting to learn more about the PhD program in that university. But we randomly assigned whether the fictional person sending that email had a name that sounded male or female and sounded white, Chinese, Hispanic, Indian, or Black. What we found that is if you were a white male, you were far more likely to receive a response back than if you were in all those other categories put together as a group.
Some of this could be explicit racism, but it's far more likely that in many cases, these professors are just busy. They can't respond to every email they get. So they kind of let their subconscious decide for them. And that's where their biases come through. Research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't. And we tend to help people who are similar to us. But you aren't 6,500 randomly selected professors. So how can you figure out where you might be making similar unconscious choices? First, there's a well-known test online you can take that can help show you biases you hold. Or
just do an audit. Whatever data you have, whether it's formal data in a computer or whether it's just data that's sort of anecdotal, look at the data. For example, I met this fantastic executive in Silicon Valley. He takes great pride in being someone who actively tries to achieve gender balance on his teams, knowing that Silicon Valley and tech are skewed heavily male.
So he looked at his professional social network, his Twitter, his LinkedIn.
He found his network was far more skewed male than he expected. So there is a place where he could actively work to shift that, and that's what he's been doing since then.
So this is not a scientifically exact self-audit, but it can still be useful, and you can audit anything. So maybe start by taking that online test for bias. Maybe check out whose emails you're replying to. But you can also audit yourself for implicit bias by asking a friend to observe you in the real world. If you're a teacher, have people look at who you call on most in class, whatever your interactions are.
One practical thing that people should do is take stock of their friends. It would be very useful for people to actually make lists of people with whom they spend time.
Look for patterns. That's the audit. That's the assessment we can all do.
Dave?
So the next stage in the RISE process is inquiry. And I think that the thing that's really vital here is that you maintain the focus on your own bias, right? And you're kind of keeping this top of mind of this self-critical process and the self-examination process. So if you're looking at the image again, at the same time that you're kind of keeping top of mind whatever your biases might be, you're also examining the source and thinking about what the source can tell you. And so you're thinking about what do the people in the picture believe? How are they feeling in this moment? And so if you want to add in the chat, maybe some thoughts on this, but what do you think these young people were feeling? What do you think that they believed about this experience? And what about your own life experiences? Have you had traumatic experiences, maybe moving from one place to another, or losing someone close to you who moved away, or any sort of other traumatic experience, or being told that your culture is not good enough, that your culture doesn't count, that you need to conform to this or that in the ways that we already discussed before, right? That these are all biases that have persisted throughout history and persist today. And so there's a few great answers here in the chat. So this is the kind of work we're talking about doing, right? Scared, unsure of what's acceptable. That one to me is really powerful. Thinking about how to be yanked from your home and essentially told you have to change everything. How do you know what to change, right? How do you know what you're supposed to be doing? Stuck, defeated, fear, helplessness, the unknown, look like they're being made to be someone they aren't. Survival is a good one. So if you read firsthand accounts from people who went through these Indian schools, they talk a lot about survival, right? About what portions of this school did they have to accommodate simply to get by, and what portions could they push back against to try to preserve something of themselves, things like that. And so this inquiry process is just so vital because it's a way of linking the source to you.
Oh, I think you froze, Dave. Well,
There's a way that you can add primary sources to your own thinking and inquiry.
Thanks so much. Felicia, do you want to talk about the profile?
I do. We have a diversity profile here. And in the diversity profile, we've created this because we want you to self-reflect on who you have in your circle, businesses that you frequent, who some of your closest friends are, and what type of people do you interact with on a consistent basis. So in the profile, as you can see, there are questions where we want you to, or columns where we want you to check, I am, are you Black, are you white, are you Latina, and who do you hang out with? So it's just to give you an idea of how diverse your circle is, or how diverse your community is, or who you interact with. And if you could, you can just put it in the chat as you see this. You can put it in the chat what is shows up for you.
Thanks so much, Felicia. And one of the things that, and those of you who are educators know, the real power of students having teachers who look like them and how important that is. But there's also that power of those of us who might be white of having teachers who are different than us. And so a diversity profile, as Felicia said, is a powerful tool to use both for yourself personally, but also to engage with your students. And Dave, do you want to talk about the connection to self-awareness?
Yeah, and so as we're going through this RISE guide, you're seeing that we're kind of building, right? That we start with reflection and then we move to inquiry. And those are tools that you're using to build these skills, right? So the first skill here is self-awareness. And so now that you've done your reflection, you've done your inquiry, if you circle back to the source and you think about your own self, right? And your own relationship to the source. You can start asking some critical questions. So you've thought about, now you've inquired about the beliefs of people in the picture. How are your beliefs similar to or different from the people in the picture? So I don't expect that a lot of us have, like conceived of personal thoughts about Indian schools today, because that's not really, they don't exist anymore. But you can try to put yourself in someone's shoes and try to think about situations that are maybe similar, situations where you've seen someone told that their culture is not good enough, or been sort of, pushed back on simply for the way that they act or the way that they look. And this is where your experience comes in too. When has this happened to you? And maybe what do you wish had been different? Because the experiences here are very difficult and traumatic, that a number of these students go back to their communities and can't really find a home there because they no longer are following the cultural practices of their people. But on the other hand, they can't find a home in white society because even though they dress differently and they've converted to Christianity and they speak English and they learned a trade or whatever, they are still not white and they're still not accepted. And there's this real sense of loss for a whole generation of Native Americans here. And I think in a larger sense, this is one of the most difficult stages of this process. And I don't know, Felicia, if you had something to add, because Felicia has some really good concepts on this that I think are critical here.
I believe when we've talked about this before, when we talk about your beliefs and where your beliefs come in, it is a matter of, again, who you've been around, who has programmed you or told you what's good, what's not good, who you can hang out with, who you shouldn't hang out with. And it's generally all of their reasonings where it has been passed down over and over again, right? So it's like, if we are looking to be open to accepting others, it's important that we pay attention to what we're feeling, right, with the self-awareness, because, and you can feel it in your body generally. You'll feel something starting to happen. And sometimes, I used to refer to it like there's this little voice that says, well, where's that coming from? Where's that coming from all of a sudden? Why do you feel that way about this person? You don't even know this person. So it's so important to pay attention to that. And as we judge, I think one of the key things that I like to pass on is when we make judgments on other people, cultures, and the way that they do things that's different than our own, we essentially are making judgment on ourselves and our detachment from who we are.
Beautifully said, Felicia. And for those of you who may be in public education or private education, this photo as an exercise really can relate to the feeling that our students who might have been in public education and maybe now are in a private, or a great example is a Catholic school. I experienced that myself growing up on the southwest side of the city of Chicago. When I started my education in a public school and then went to a Catholic school, I was one of those. I was one of the publics. And that was a common thing in Chicago's South Side. You were either public school or Catholic school. There's a whole shift of fitting into that culture that our students, if they're looking at this primary source or others, they can relate to. What is it like to be in a culture where you're void of your own identity, something that you've been with for your whole life? A young African-American child growing up with African-American parents who now is in a white Catholic school setting or a white public school setting. What is that like? What is that feeling like? And then how do you wish it would be different? It gives us the opportunity to use history also in a very key way for self-awareness, so that students know they're not alone, that the feeling that they may be experiencing has been historically experienced by others, and that those students then can become the citizens of the future who make change, who say, yes, it happened to those indigenous peoples, it happened to me, I would like it not to happen again. So it's a powerful tool that leads right to empathy, and that which is the last E in RISE. And Tina, do you want to talk about empathy?
Yes, I would be happy to. When I think about empathy, empathy is like, it's the gateway to equity. It's the key to dismantling racism. I think if we truly want to see a better and more just world, we have got to grow with empathy. I think about George Floyd would be alive if the officer just showed a little empathy. Tamir Rice, 12 years old, would be alive. He was, playing with a toy gun, got shot. Michael Brown, 22, walking with a friend, because I think if we can model empathy for our students, then they learn to have empathy and they don't go out into the world and cause harm and hurt other people. And if you're saying, but Tina, that's not my responsibility to do that, that's their parents' responsibility, I beg to differ. It's all of our responsibility. Our students, as Dr. Keel said, they are our future innovators and our future policymakers, our policymakers of tomorrow. And so they need something to soak up, something to absorb.
So well said, Tina. And you know, when we think about empathy, empathy is a skill that can be taught. And that's our responsibility as educators. It can be taught through different social emotional learning strategies, but the most important way it's taught is through modeling. And to break down empathy, there are actually 3 distinct types of empathy. And empathy has been the research that consumes much of my time, because understanding empathy and being at the core is the way that you can teach it then to students. The first type of empathy is cognitive empathy. It's that empathy that says, you know, you look like you're suffering. I can cognitively think, oh yeah, that's pain. I understand what that is. I understand what sorrow is. I feel bad for you. Move on. That's cognitive empathy. We are not emotionally invested. Emotional empathy, the second type of empathy, is that empathy that gets you closer to that person. And you can envision cognitive empathy, you're separated. Emotional empathy, you take 2 steps closer. And now when you're sorrow, when you feel sad, I know exactly what that feels like because I felt this before. And now I feel connected to you. What you're feeling, I'm feeling. So I'm with you. It is experiencing your feeling with you. But it still leaves you a bit of distance because your problem is your problem. It's not my problem. Then there's the last kind of empathy, which is compassionate empathy that bridges that gap, that says, because you're hurting and I know what that feels like, to the best of my ability, I want to take action so that you don't hurt any longer. It's compassionate empathy that helps us to bridge the trauma of racism, that helps us to be activists and citizens who actually want to stop the injustices, stop what happened to those Indigenous children, stop what happens to our African-American and Brown and Asian children in our classrooms. It's the compassionate empathy that combines our cognitive empathy, our emotional empathy, into that deeper level of compassion. We feel compassion for our students every day. When you combine compassion and empathy, when you actually feel the compassion because you know what that feeling is like, you're always motivated to action. So if you've ever been marginalized yourself, if you've ever been cast aside, if you've ever been judged, if you have, you're human, then if you connect with that feeling, you'll feel that compassion and empathy that calls you to action. And Dave, I think you want to give us an example in the primary source.
Yeah, and just to sort of pull together, I think there's been so many powerful things said here. Kind of pulling this together, I think that Tina is exactly right, that empathy has to be an action, right? That it can't just be a feeling, it has to lead us toward improving the world. And so if we're using these sources to create feelings of empathy, to understand that, like Donna said, that people have suffered in the past, right? That people have suffered oppression and racism and judgment, but they've also pushed through, right? And built lives, and things have changed, sometimes for the worse, but sometimes for the better. That you can see a lens into this in the past that helps us understand the present and the future. And I think that it's important to remember too, a couple of other things that people said. One is that Donna mentioned that empathy is a skill. And I just wanted to say that again, this is so important, that you have to practice empathy, and it gets easier as you do it, but it doesn't just happen on its own. You absolutely have to practice it and make it a value in your classroom to be empathetic with one another, and then with the wider world and with the sources you're looking at. And I think that the path to that is what we're talking about here with RISE, and how self-awareness is part of this too. That you can't really be empathetic toward others if you're not aware of who you are yourself. And so our hope with RISE is that when you look at a source like this and you see the struggles that these students went through, it helps you empathize with their plight, but it also gives you insight into the plight of people today, and gives you some idea of how you can use that empathy to improve the world around you, and not just kind of look backward, but look forward as well.
Beautifully said, Dave. And Felicia, you want to give us a tool to dismantling?
Yeah, so in dismantling and taking civic action, where do we begin? Sometimes I think there are those of us who we get lost, or we feel like it's, oh, the issue is too big for us to do. It's just too much. Who am I? But I say just taking small steps in your community, talking to your neighbor, taking the time to interact more with your students that you have, and asking how you can help, and being the change that you want to see, and we all want to see in the world.
Thanks so much. And I think Tina and Felicia, they have a call for us all.
So the PowerPoint slide says, what can you do? Commit to doing something to increasing diversity in your life. I just want to say this: if you only encounter people who do not look like you at work, that's a sign that you need to get some diversity in your life. And when I think about how people constantly tell us at DePaul, this was a great session, thank you, thank you, thank you, and we appreciate that. But you know what we prefer? We prefer you go back and just show up differently for your young people. That's what we want. Then we'll know it was a really, really great session. We don't want you to just feel good and feel empowered, and then you go back to same old, same old. So the next time we're together, I want to hear you say, yeah, you know, I hung out with maybe some Black friends. I made some Asian friends. That's what I want to hear you say. And so you have a choice. You can blaze a new trail, or you can continue the path of injustice. When I think about the young people that I teach, who I love so much, I want them to live in a world where they thrive in a multicultural world, not one where they fear it and they resist it. And you're going to have to change all that.
And you can. It is an ongoing process, as in self-reflection, self-awareness, and the inquiry that you'll have with yourself. It is something that we continuously do every day. I've been doing it forever, and I'm still uncovering things about even myself. Racial equity is something that we can't go backwards. We just can't. We can, but it's going to be crazy. If you think it's crazy now, it's going to get crazier. I'm grateful to have you guys join us, and let's forge together forward.
Thank you all so much. And I think the quote of the night from Dr. Curry is, empathy is the gateway to equity. As we close today on time, I want to thank Sheila Smith from the Barra Education Foundation and the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources Program and Grant, and my colleagues at DePaul, Dr. Curry, Dr. Bates, and Felicia. Thank you so much for lending your expertise. We'll be back in March. I hope you can join us then. If you have not yet registered for our micro-credential, feel free to do so. For those of you who are in the micro-credential, thank you so much for your insights and sharing so vulnerably of your heart. And let's go out and do something brave today and continue to do that every day until we meet again in our next session. So thank you all so very much.